My next patron question is from Lowell, who wanted to know about a specific creative choice made by a certain franchise. So there's been a lot of discussion about the Star Wars prequels and sequels lately. Many people online are wondering if the sequels will ever get the same reappraisal as the prequels. The hate for the sequels definitely was over the top, and none of the actors or filmmakers deserve to be bullied or harassed like that. And as someone who grew up with the prequels, I remember being bullied by older Star Wars fans for liking them. It was really traumatizing, and I don't want any younger fans of the sequel trilogy to feel the same way. But here's the thing. The opening line of The Force Awakens is, "This will begin to make things right." Many fans at the time thought that was a dig at the prequels, like J.J. Abrams was saying, "I'm going to get right what George Lucas got wrong." Was the Star Wars sequel trilogy made as a middle finger to George Lucas, the prequels, and fans like me who grew up with the prequels? And if it was, then doesn't that compromise them a little? Doesn't it make it karma for them to get bashed like the prequels? As someone with a fondness for the sequel trilogy, this is something interesting to think about. Was the sequel trilogy intentionally trying to reverse the ship from the prequels and the divisive and even vitriolic reaction they received in some quarters? I do remember how the advertising was making a big deal about how the aesthetic for the new movies would be closer to the original trilogy than to the prequels. Like Disney and Lucasfilm were trying to win over people who may have soured on Star Wars after the prequels, although I don't think enthusiasm waned as much as it seemed. After all, as mocked as Attack of the Clones was, Revenge of the Sith still ended up making more at the box office, as a lot of people remained interested in seeing Anakin's turn to the dark side. J.J. Abrams was 11 when the first Star Wars movie was released, so the original trilogy would be what he's most nostalgic for and heavily influenced by. Thus it makes sense why he would gravitate towards emulating the style of those movies over the prequels, and I also think people at Lucasfilm were conscious of what people disliked about the prequels, hence trying to use as many practical effects as possible, bring in Lawrence Kasdan to work on the script, capture the style of dialogue associated with the original films, and the lack of Senate hearings and talk about trade routes. Abrams did say in an interview he wanted to show Jar Jar Binks' skeleton remains in The Force Awakens, and let's be honest, the character has been a source of mockery for years, so I can understand why he thought that would be amusing. But even though I myself am not particularly fond of the character, I do think that would have been a tad mean-spirited. I actually much prefer the fate of Jar Jar as revealed in a Star Wars novel that was published in 2017. Set after Return of the Jedi, it reveals that he wound up relegated to a street performer who often entertains children after he was partly blamed for the rise of the Empire. I think that's a much more creative future of him and more thematically compelling than just having him dead somewhere. While The Force Awakens largely ignored the prequels, The Last Jedi did delve into them, with Luke himself having his own readings of the Jedi's actions that led to their fall and the rise of Darth Vader. And what Luke says is, I think, an accurate reflection of how we're supposed to view the Jedi in the prequels. The Jedi Council does bear some responsibility for Anakin turning to Palpatine for help with their rejection of him, as well as their own antiquated laws leading him to keep his romance with Padme a secret. I don't think we're meant to see the Jedi in the prequels as always making the right choices, and that hubris helped Palpatine find a way to corrupt Anakin to the dark side. The Jedi were basically like a religious monastery who saw themselves as a force for good and set far too rigid rules for those who joined them. The prequels were definitely critical of the Jedi Council in particular, and Qui-Gon Jinn was also at fault for taking this young boy away from his mother without recognizing the mental effect this might have on him. I think The Last Jedi thematically strengthened the prequels with Luke's analysis of the Jedi and how he himself tried to avoid those same mistakes, but even he's not perfect. Some other recent entries in the franchise have used elements from the prequels. While Rogue One is set directly before the events of A New Hope, there are nods to the prequels, primarily with the use of actors like Jimmy Smits. And Solo, a Star Wars story, has a particularly deliberate connection to the prequels, with the return of a certain villain. Some of the Disney Plus series have acknowledged the prequels. So much of Obi-Wan Kenobi involves watching him as he's still reeling from the events of Revenge of the Sith, and there are a few scenes set during the prequel era. Hayden Christensen was even brought back for both this series and Ahsoka. But back to the Abrams films, something worth mentioning is he did include a few voice cameos from the prequel actors in The Rise of Skywalker, with Christensen, Ewan McGregor, Liam Neeson, and Samuel L. Jackson having their voices heard during the film. And Palpatine quotes a few of his lines from Revenge of the Sith, an acknowledgement of how important that film was to the character's legacy. So do I think the sequel trilogy was trying to spite the prequels? I think it was more a case of the filmmakers thinking people did not like the prequels and wanted something closer to the original trilogy. And before The Force Awakens was released, that was a period when people spread those red-letter media videos around like gospel, and there were actually people happy that George Lucas had no involvement in the new movie. Of course, because the Star Wars fan base is fickle, now they want him back and think Disney did a terrible thing by not involving him. Some of them may have changed course, but the rest of us remember them saying George Lucas ruined their childhood and other nonsense. Even as someone with mixed feelings on The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, I also think there are things to admire in those films, and they should be considered important parts of the Skywalker saga. It's nice to see them reevaluated a bit, and I do think in maybe 20 years' time we'll see the generation who grew up with the sequel films look back fondly on those. But the most important thing to do is to stop gatekeeping fans. Someone can become a Star Wars fan in 1977, or from watching the prequels, or from seeing the sequels, or even through the animated series, comic books, theme park rides, or LEGO television specials. It does not make them a lesser fan if that's the thing they cherish, and nobody should be disrespected for getting enjoyment out of a specific part of a franchise. Thank you for your question, Lowell.